Hello everyone! In this masterclass we will sew these wonderful little panties together. They are actually sewn very quickly, so let's not waste any time and get straight to work. I will be cutting the fabric using my own patterns. I will need 2 back pieces cut on the fold, 1 front piece, a central piece, 2 side front pieces and 1 gusset piece made of cotton, also cut on the fold. I have already cut out the pieces. The back of the panties will be made from elastic mesh. The central front piece of the panties will be made from this kind of silk. It stretches very well, it's super elastic. So this is not regular Armani silk, it's something else that stretches really well. So keep that in mind. If you are going to sew with Armani silk, you will need to slightly enlarge the patterns because my patterns are designed for elastic fabric. And next are the front side pieces of the panties. Mine will be made from this kind of lace with eyelash edges. This lace doesn't stretch well at all, so keep that in mind too. If you use non-elastic lace like mine, you'll also need to slightly enlarge the patterns. And 1 gusset piece made of cotton. I already have a tutorial where I showed in detail how to enlarge a pattern if it's designed for stretch fabric but you happen to have non-stretch fabric. I'll leave a link to that tutorial somewhere here, where I explain exactly how you can enlarge the patterns. I'll explain in a bit more detail how to cut out the back piece. For this, you will need to take a little square of mesh like this. I already have this piece cut out, but let's imagine this is a square. The grain line runs like this, and then you need to fold the square corner to corner along the diagonal. After that, place the pattern piece on top like this and cut out the piece. Use the pattern to find the center seam. And now we need to place these 2 pieces right sides together and sew a seam on the overlocker. I'll pin the pieces together so the mesh doesn't slip. I'm going to go ahead and just snip off this yarn tail right here, and then on the other side I will use my crochet hook to weave and hide the tail into the seam. But you can also just cut it off. Don't forget to press the seam. Next, we move on to the gusset. Our gusset will not be closed, but open, so we simply finish the upper edge of the gusset with the overlocker. And here on the pattern pieces, pay attention. If your gusset is the same as mine, you'll need to cut off this seam allowance. I carefully tucked away the overlock thread tails neatly inside the seam allowance. And now we need to securely join all of these individual pieces together along this edge. To do this, we take the back piece, place it right sides together with the front piece, and align the centers of these pieces. Here, the thread tails from the front piece should be longer than the edge of the back piece. That's normal. I pin it in place. Next, I carefully place the gusset piece with the right side facing the wrong side of the back piece, also making sure to align the centers perfectly, and then I pin it securely, effectively joining all 3 layers of the fabric together into one single seam. Just like this. I'll also pin the edges. Now we sew a seam here on the overlocker. Here's what I have so far. I tucked the overlock thread tails inside the seam. Smooth everything out and you get this kind of construction. Now I'll press this seam so it doesn't stick out. Here we have seam allowances left and we'll need them to finish these edges with elastic. So later it will be folded like this, the elastic will go here and everything will be nice and even. Now I need to sew a basting stitch on one side of the gusset and on the other side of the gusset. This way I'll secure it, and then along these edges I'll attach the side pieces of the front to the center piece. Now I will sew a seam 1 centimeter from the edge. I'll choose a special stretch stitch. It's basically a very fine zigzag. This stitch will allow the seam to remain elastic. You can also just use a small zigzag or finish this edge with an overlock. I don't want to make this area thicker, so I won't use an overlock stitch. But to make things easier, you can use an overlock here as well. This is how it turned out for me. I've already pressed this seam allowance toward the center front piece. This is how I folded this little corner. I laid one side of the seam allowance over the other, and that way I got a very neat little corner here. I'm going to trim these corners now, and this little corner, this nub from the lace, let me show it so you can see. I'll also carefully trim it now. I stitched the seam without stopping. That is, I first went like this, then immediately turned a little and continued on. So I didn't finish the seam here. It's a continuous stitch. And now I want to secure these seam allowances so they don't stick out. I will do this by sewing along the seam allowance with a 3-step zigzag, and in this way I will secure it. Be sure to press everything with an iron after stitching. And here you can trim the edge even more neatly. To finish the raw edges, I will use this kind of elastic. Next, we move on to finishing this edge. To do this, I need to measure the length of this edge and subtract 15% from the resulting number, and that will be the required length for this elastic. When measuring the length, I recommend using the pattern pieces, because the fabric can stretch or become deformed during sewing, and you might end up measuring the wrong length. So it's better to do this using the patterns. So I ended up with 28.5 centimeters as the length for this elastic, and I also added 1 centimeter for the seam allowance on one side. On the other side, everything is even here, the edges line up perfectly. I've already distributed the elastic evenly along the edge, and now I'm going to sew a zigzag stitch very close to the beginning of this lace edge, that is, close to these little holes. Place the elastic face to face with the panties and direct the lace edge toward the panties. Next, we need to fold the seam allowance of the elastic to the wrong side of the panties like this. At this stage, you can even baste this little end to secure it so you don't have to worry about it anymore. After that, turn the elastic itself to the wrong side of the panties. You see right here, this little end is sticking out a bit. That's why it's best to baste the end at this stage. And after we've turned the elastic, we need to sew another zigzag stitch right here, but this time as close to the edge of the elastic as possible. By the way, I do the basting with water-soluble thread. I'll show you now. It's a fairly strong thread that completely dissolves in water. Thanks to this thread, I've truly come to love basting with all my heart. First of all, I enjoy the process of watching it dissolve. And secondly, of course, certain moments in sewing that are very delicate, very meticulous, very fine motor and complex turn out much neater if you reinforce them with a basting stitch. And we will finish the upper part of the panties separately. First, I will sew the elastic to the front piece of the panties, and then I will finish the upper edge of the back piece with elastic as well. To do this, I will now measure the length of the upper edge using the pattern, and then again using the pattern, I will measure the length of the upper edge of the back of the panties, subtract 15% from the resulting number, and that will be the length of the elastic. There is no need to add seam allowances to the elastic here, so we measure the exact length of the upper edge of the front and back pieces. I will now show in more detail how this is done. We measure the length of the upper edge of the front piece along this front side piece. That is, we place the ruler starting from here and take measurements all the way to the end, taking this seam allowance into account. For me, this comes out to 20 centimeters, and I multiply these 20 centimeters by 2 since the front consists of these two pieces. Accordingly, that makes 40, and from those 40 centimeters, I subtract 15%. This will be the length of the elastic for the front piece of the panties. And I do the same for the back piece. That is, I place the ruler here at the beginning and measure exactly to the end, taking the seam allowance into account. We don't take these central seam allowances into account because they've been sewn into the seam. So in fact, we no longer have this length. Accordingly, I multiply the obtained length by 2 and subtract 15%. Now I turn the front piece of the panties so the wrong side is facing me, place the elastic with its right side against the wrong side of the panties, and now I need to evenly distribute it along the top of the front piece. I have distributed the elastic and secured it with pins. Now I'll explain the principles I followed. First, I covered the little corner that formed from one seam overlapping another with the elastic. Second, I tried to lay the elastic close to the base of the scallop, leaving the tip free. This way, the upper part of the front piece of the panties will fit snugly against the body. But because the tips are left free from the elastic, they will still appear airy and kind of floating freely. I will be stitching the elastic with a 3-step zigzag, and while attaching the elastic, I will make sure that the elastic itself does not go above this edge where the scalloped lace edge ends. You need to pay attention to these details so that the elastic does not peek out on the right side. And right now, I will distribute the elastic along the back of the panties. In this case, I will place the elastic face to face. The scalloped edge of the elastic is facing towards the panties. For convenience, you can fold the elastic in half, mark the center, and pin the center to the center, then the edges to the edges, and after that, while stretching the elastic, distribute these sections separately. Before finishing the top edge of the panties, I basted it. I stitched this seam on the sewing machine with a regular straight stitch. I set the upper tension to minimum and the stitch length to maximum so that later it would be as easy as possible to remove this thread. I distributed the elastic and now I need to sew a zigzag stitch very close to the scalloped edge of the elastic. I have sewn on the elastic. At this stage, you need to remove the basting stitch that we used to join the mesh pieces. And if the edge of the back piece is sticking out here, you should trim it as well. After that, we fold the elastic to the wrong side like this. And we make a second zigzag stitch, but this time close to the edge of the elastic. These are the stitches I ended up with. I had to spend a little extra time on this section since I was sewing the entire length of the elastic with brown thread both in the bobbin and on the spool. But right here, if you use brown thread, it doesn't look very nice. So I had to rip out this section, put white thread in the bobbin, and sew over this area with a zigzag stitch using white thread in the bobbin. Right here, I tied the threads into a knot and tucked the thread ends inside. And here basically there were no surprises. On top I used brown thread and on the bottom white thread throughout all the steps of attaching this elastic. Next, all that's left is to sew the panties together along the side seams. Place the front and back pieces, right sides together, pin them, and I'll sew the seam with an overlock machine. And this is the seam I got on one side and on the other side. I carefully tucked the overlock thread tails inside the seam, and then I thoroughly pressed the seam allowance toward the back of the panties. You can also take a moment to neatly baste this seam allowance to the back of the panties, so it doesn't move or flap around loosely like you see here. the patterns for these panties myself. I don't have any website where you can purchase my patterns. But if you're eager to sew exactly this model, you can write to me in my Telegram channel in the comments under absolutely any post, saying that you want the patterns from the latest masterclass. After that, we'll get in touch and I'll explain how you can purchase the patterns. Most likely this isn't a very convenient or familiar way to purchase patterns. I used to have a website with patterns, but no one was buying them, so I decided to just close the site. Of course, if more people become interested in buying my patterns, I'll bring the website back, and there will once again be a quick and easy way to purchase patterns through the site. So don't be afraid, just write to me in the Telegram channel. All my patterns are already prepared, so I will be able to send them to you very quickly, just manually,